Hey everyone, welcome to the channel where our furry doggo reads stories of D&D cringe to you. Bards. One of the most memed classes of character to play in a tabletop RPG, like Dungeons & Dragons. It's a common trope to think that most bards are overly horny, music singing, or promiscuous style characters. Though they can be played in different ways, much like the example in this next story. Though, unfortunately for the OP in the story, not everyone thinks that. But first, let's have Lucky regale you with a song.
Lucky.
Ah, such a beautiful voice. Anyway, let's get into the story. New player incapable of understanding non-musical bard and throws a fit in and out of character. By Reddit user, That Aries Bloke. This takes place a few years ago when 5e was a little more new and shiny, and nobody knew exactly how broken you could make a bard under the new rules in terms of RP and general skill monkeying. Due to work and life-based time constraints, I was the very last to make a character. A faux pas for long-term D&D players, but I was given a pass as I had known most of the players at the table and the DM for some time. The issue came with our new player, a 3rd edition, 3.5 edition, and Pathfinder veteran like ourselves, but one that had been lucky enough to avoid the perils and tribulations the rest of us had with 4th edition. This led to a few minor integration issues with the party, initially, as we tended to lament the Fallen Edition quite aggressively. As I said, 5th edition was quite new to us at the time, and upon reading the player's handbook, I found myself falling in love with the new edition's take on the traditional bard class at a core level. More specifically, the College of Lore. In my mind, this was the perfect way to craft a bard that was less of a jester or musician, and more of a round-the-campfire storyteller. So I could lean heavily into persuasion, intimidation, and deception as a way to bypass combat and generally help out more as a diplomat. I made Egbert Tupain during Session 0, an odd chap with a weird French accent. Nothing much to write home about. It was a typical half-elf bard, nothing fancy. About as plain as white bread, and about as charming and sweet, as it was possible to make said bread via the player's handbook, with one exception. I requested that, in lieu of an instrument, I be allowed to carry a book of tales and stories, that, as part of my background, I be allowed to collect the various trials and tribulations of the party, and any tales they opted to share. The DM agreed, and the next week, the plot began in earnest. Again, for us, this was a new edition, so the DM kept it pretty cookie-cutter, you meet in a bar, style, with Egbert collecting various stories of adventure and intrigue. Now, as I had little else to work with, I, understandably, started my works with random offcuts from 3rd and 4th edition tales of idiocy that the vast majority of the table would recognize as prior characters and adventures. How I worked this into the game, during persuasion and intimidation rolls, was to tell short, blunt, and cautionary tales of prior shopkeepers, guards, and adventurers, and how non-compliance with our requests had led to various forms of undress, murder, and inherent violence by foul deviants and rogues that the players at the table instantly recognized as things they had done in prior games. Example, you do know that simply refusing to sell an item at a reasonable price has led to barbarians, just like that one over there, to becoming quite upset, and poor, unfortunate, and clearly innocent store owners such as yourself, finding said item forced into orifices of a most personal nature and being wielded like a makeshift club against the local constabulary while their property is robbed and burned to the ground. I'm not saying that will happen here, but I do have the details documented in this book if you would like to read it. Or perhaps I could read it to you. Once upon a time, and at this point, the DM would have me roll for persuasion and intimidation, generally to much hilarity and reminiscence on said event out of character. This went well for roughly 3 to 4 sessions with me breaking out Eggy's big book of stories, Only twice before I was informed by another player that our new player and rogue was getting a bit miffed already at my shenanigans, as I was clearly not a bard, and demanding that I should, under Raw, not be able to cast any form of magic without an instrument, as casting from a book would make me a wizard, not a bard, and promptly had his character attempt to steal my book and destroy it while I slept. I was a bit confused, as non-musical bards have been a thing in 3rd edition and Pathfinder for quite some time, and were pretty common as diplomats, detectives, and general wandering storytellers. He argued that, in spite of years of playing, he had never seen nor heard of such a thing, and that my story should be reduced to a simple dice roll, as my needless, incessant RP crap was unnecessary and slowed down the game. After all, what was I going to do? Talk them to death? The DM did in fact allow the rogue to roll to steal my book. I wasn't happy about it, but nonetheless, his table, his rules. The rogue succeeded easily and promptly burned it in the campfire. Suffice to say, both in character and out of character, I was less than happy. The DM did somewhat come to my rescue and pointed out that although my stories in their written form may have been destroyed, they remained fully in the memory and at the disposal of my bard. And due to my nature as a potential College of Lore bard, I could easily have these transcribed as part of my studies as I leveled up. In fact, in destroying the book, Eggy would remember this most notably and would later put it to good use. In the meantime, the rogue was moderately mollified, and although I was still annoyed, I had been playing with this DM for long enough to know he had something in mind. I, in character, was still however livid, but at the table's prompting, continued to use stories of past insanity and glory as part of my persuasion and intimidation rolls, albeit much shorter, as any time I attempted it, the rogue would go into a huff and play on his phone or randomly start stealing things while RP happened. I had presumed that this was a simple case of feeling left out of the stories I was telling, or that he was simply a power gamer with no desire to RP, and kinda just went with it in spite of his grunting, childish humps during any form of an RP-based session, only really getting into the game during combat, which, thanks to a pretty min-max build, was aggressively dominant, even at 4th level. Our newfound resident power gamer was more than happy enough for me to use my spells at this point when he discovered the joys of Cookin' Book and my tiny hut, but insisted that RP should remain a just roll the dice situation. Now, I don't know about you, but I play D&D for RP as much as I do for combat and power fantasy, and at this stage, in spite of nearly 3 months of weekly play, I was getting pretty damn sick of having my creativity curbed by a player that, rather than RP, insisted on either killing the NPCs or disengaging from the table while the rest of the party played things out. Thankfully, I wasn't the only one. The DM advised us of a level up and a short time skip while we trained and/or educated ourselves. Our resident barbarian opted to visit home and found an unfortunate plot hook unrelated to this. The druid contemplated nature in unusual places. Our fighter opted to become a paladin, and the rogue insisted that he be allowed to become a war rat as part of his induction into a local rogues guild that we had previously run into, who were almost universally such creatures. I went back to college, as the DM instructed that by the end of this, we would meet up at 6th level. Clearly, I opted to learn Fireball and Polymorph. We misinterpreted the spell list at this stage, due to being new to 5e. I did, however, take Polymorph properly next level, and substituted the spell from my bonus spell list accordingly. I also spent the vast majority of my funds getting my book published and distributed over the 6 months we had been separated, in which a full description of the events of The Lost Time were told, along with a full and complete description of our rogue, with his physicality and face described in oddly specific detail, every item that I was aware that he had ever stolen, the location of the stores he had stolen from, directly from my own notes, and his last known whereabouts, including a special note on what he had stolen directly from the Thieves Guild he had opted to join during the time skip. The DM insisted I roll to find out how well I had described the incriminating events, as I was in the high teens, but with my charisma now capped out, this was pushed into the mid-20s. Not exactly a bestseller, but popular enough to earn me some funds and recognition, and to put our newly rodent-like rogue into a spotlight he was less than happy about. Was I the asshole? Yes, absolutely. But no regrets. Why? Because the twit was playing on his phone while the DM described in detail the entirety of what happened, and the rogue ignored it completely because it was, and I quote, RP crap and mechanically irrelevant. I believe the DM took that personally, and soon every other wall had a poster of our erstwhile rodent rogue. His guild went batshit over the spotlight and started sending kill teams after him. Oddly, he loved this. Guards recognized him instantly. Not so much this. And he was effectively banned from every town and city we had been in prior to the time skip. This he didn't mind, as it justified him in missing RP and shopping sessions that he simply opted not to turn up to when he knew one was planned. I found myself polymorphing the rogue and putting him to various cages, boxes, etc., to pass him off as a pet during such sessions. More out of concession to the DM than anything else, as the rogue simply wasn't there to advise what he was doing while we shopped and RP'd. It all came to a head when he simply started texting the DM prior to games and asking if it was an RP session, and if it was, opting not to turn up. Effectively, we ended up with a pet that sometimes turned into a rogue to fight and then popped back in its cage, and we basically started treating him as such. The weird thing is, our DM did in fact reward XP for RP. The rogue was fully aware of this, but expected his fair share of said XP for simply being present in animal form. The DM disagreed, and with much grumping and frustration, our errant rogue opted to join us for a pretty major plot hook, and the DM dangled the chance of combat over his tiny rodent brain. RP with the local lord went really well, until the rogue got bored and decided that, in hamster form, the shape I had opted for this time, went scouting, and got himself stood upon, shifted to his normal shape, got arrested, and attempted to fight his way out of it, screaming that we should help him, and that if we killed this local lord that we had been courting for the past month and a half, we could take over, and... The DM had finally had enough. He retconned him into a permanent party pet with delusions of grandeur, and kicked him from the party and the table. The scene was so scenery-chewing that it may as well have been a Shatner-level performance of Hamlet, including a failed attempt to flip the table, and an extended encore in which he berated our RP and once again cursed me out for not being a real bard and ruining his fun, and that I should just have played a fucking wizard. Suffice to say, the story of Roland the Delusional Rat is still told around certain tabletops, and thankfully, I only ran into the player once more, in which I watched him attempt to DM a Pathfinder Society game of the most browbeaten and dejected players I had ever seen in my life. They perked up when I told them the story quite a bit. Pity it didn't really help them at that table, but I digress. The odd thing is, with the DM playing the former rogue simply as a pet rat, it did become a pretty significant plot point, as with the rogue just vanishing off the face of the realm, a manhunt was afoot to finally put him into custody, which led us to trying to convince the Inquisition that the rodent pet with us was not in fact a transformed rogue, and that a common rat we found was after its immediate confession, 1 squeak yes, 2 squeaks no, and some persuasive RP, which led to a tiny rat-sized hanging from our former PC turned rodent, settling into the life of a family man, or rat, with the rodent's nest out of inherited personal guilt. I honestly tried to make sense of that last sentence, but I really couldn't. Moving on. He later accidentally turned up, having started an in-game version of the Black Plague, but that's another story. I mean, I know some people just play for combat and power fantasy, but I kinda need some RP in my tabletop RPGs, you know? Each to their own, but it does go to show how incompatible players can be if they feel differently towards the game and can't force dice over dialogue at the table. Well, at least the DM and party were still able to make use of Rogue's character after kicking him out. It can be pretty frustrating to have a player at the table that is disengaged and indifferent to the actual RP in tabletop RPGs. And for Rogue to state that the RP crap is mechanically irrelevant would rub any good DM the wrong way. They are taking the time to make the world, characters, and situations for the players to interact with, and saying that is just shitting all over that hard work. If Rogue only wants mechanics, he should just go play a video game. No love lost for this player. And, by the looks of it, we have time for a bonus story, so let's hop right in. The quote-unquote bard, by Reddit user Sir Featherbottom. Greetings one and all. I just discovered this subreddit, and finally, I have a place to share this story. The story stars myself, 3 of my friends, let's call them Johnny, Lisa, and Peter, and an acquaintance, Danny. Let's begin, shall we? I knew Peter because he lived across the street from me for years. Danny lived a few streets away, and I sort of knew him, but not well enough to call him a friend. I knew Johnny and Lisa through Peter, and they were good people, and they were engaged to be married. While talking with Peter and Danny one day, I happened to mention that I was missing playing Dungeons & Dragons, and even had the bare bones of an idea for a campaign. I just had nowhere to host a game. Danny immediately volunteered his place, which had a large dining room with a giant table and several chairs. Wonderful, we all thought. Peter, Danny, Lisa, and Johnny all generated characters, and I purchased some models for the players to use. A laminated blank map to lay out the scenarios, and I got to work fleshing out the campaign. Lisa decided to play a half-elf druid, Johnny decided on a human fighter, Peter chose a tabaxi rogue, and Danny decided on a dragonborn bard. This will become important later. The first session went off without a hitch. We all had fun, got to know each other's characters, established the setting and story of the campaign, and just generally had a lovely time. Danny made some, let's say, odd remarks about the tabaxi and Johnny's character, but we shrugged it off. The second session is when the problems really started. Over the course of the next 12 sessions, the things that Danny did included writing songs to go with his spellbook, which were, in fact, just verses of songs he liked, bringing sessions to a screeching halt in order to sing these songs, and if anyone interrupted him, he would just start over again, offering to help the party get information out of a terrified kobold by molesting it, offering to help the party get past a door puzzle involving a mummified corpse by molesting it, offering to help the tabaxi rogue recover during a long rest by, you get the idea, repeatedly offering to beat monsters by beating them at Yu-Gi-Oh!, informing us of dreams he had about explicit encounters between his character and Johnny's, and asking if he would be interested in that, in front of Lisa, I might add. Constantly belittling Peter for the smallest misread of the rules. Bringing snacks for the group containing nuts, to which Lisa was allergic. This one didn't really matter since he would eat 95% of these himself, but it's still worth mentioning. You might be asking yourself why I didn't do anything. Oh, dear reader, I tried. I genuinely tried to kill his character in very subtle ways, without having to resort to RFED. But, my dear reader, as well as being an utterly repugnant human being, Danny was also ridiculously lucky. I'm not entirely sure how I offended the dice gods, but every poisoned water spring, every trap inside a treasure chest, every boss monster that targeted him, the dice would conspire against me. We attempted to talk to Danny about his conduct, but his response was, quote, "Well, if you guys want to find somewhere else to play, I totally understand." Eventually, the campaign ended. I moved away from the area, and I lost contact with everyone except Peter. To this day, dear reader, I still get a shiver down my spine when I recall the Bard. I appreciate that this post was a bit of a slog to get through, but I also appreciate you for taking the time to read it. May your rolls be ever natural 20s. Hey, that last part is my line. Anyway, unlike that first story, this player wanted to play right into the Bard trope. Danny sounded like a standard that guy, trying to do things in-game by molesting NPCs should have been a hard limit. And OP should have stopped the game right then and there to tell Danny that that wasn't okay, and that it was not happening in the game. Though, it did sound like OP and the rest of the party did try to talk to him later, to which he just said that he would just kick them out of his house, since that's where the games were hosted. But at that point, you know the saying by now. No D&D is better than bad D&D. Do you have a D&D horror story involving the musical musings of a bard? If so, and you would like this Doge to read it, be sure to post it in the comments, on the channel subreddit, or even just at me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you who watch and like my videos, and here is Lucky with another song. Such a beautiful voice. Until next time.